Tony Ortiz here with a class primer guide for the Hero's Journey Everquest emulated server. We are in the Planes of Power era. It just launched a few days ago. I have recently completed all of the content, and I wanted to come and chat with all of you about what classes are doing right now, what classes are fun combinations with each other, what makes sense, kind of give you a little bit of a primer. Because I know new players coming into the game, when they really sit down, it's hard enough to choose one class as it is. And then when you're asked to choose three, that's even more of an interesting, complicated issue. And how do I go about even doing any of this? So effectively what I want to do today is go through all 16 classes, talk about their strengths, their weaknesses, some of the things they synergize with, whether or not they're really great for solo play, group play, and so on. Kind of give you an idea of what you can do, how you want to build your character, and and so on. But before we get started, I just want to say I have a small primer video that I recorded right before this that will probably be much shorter than this one. That if you're new to EverQuest, if you don't know anything about EverQuest and you've heard about this from a friend or two, you want to check that out real quick. You can go absolutely do that. The reason I made it is because I wanted to make this, and I didn't want to make this without a small companion up front to let brand new people know exactly what's going on. With what I'm talking about here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to link to that in the description down below, and I'll also have links to the web pages and and so on. And those will be able to take you to the community Discord and so on, and all of the other resources you need to get started in playing the game. Now, everyone else is going to be able to tell you exactly what to do to get this game up and running and so on. They've all done that legwork. I want to give all credit to them and send you over to them. I just want to talk about classes in a casual and interesting way because I really feel like that hasn't really truly been done, or if it has been done, it's been done on live stream. It's not been put to a YouTube kind of thing yet. And if it has, more power to anybody who has done that. But when I watch a lot of the content out there that exists these days, it's riddled with ads, or it's coming from people that have specific ideas and how this thing should be done and that thing should be done. And I just kind of want to give like an unbiased kind of like, if you're trying to get this out of the game, this is what you want to look at kind of perspective, right? Like a friend, like if I was a friend trying to get you to play the game, I want to encourage any kind of style of play that you want to do. And I want to enable you to do all those things. So that's kind of like where I'm coming from with this. And again, it's overwhelming. When I, as a longtime veteran EverQuest player, was made aware of the server's existence maybe about a week or two after it launched, I had no idea what I was going to do. And what I ended up doing was I picked the three classes that I loved playing the most back in the day in the base game. Okay, so if that's the way you want to do things, you can just, if you have experience prior with EverQuest, you want to pick the classes that you absolutely love and adore and play all three of those together at the same time. Go ahead and do that. Even if there's no synergy whatsoever between any of them, if that's what you think will let you have the most fun, that's exactly what you should do. But if you want to take more of like a measured approach, you want to do a little theory crafting in your mind, if that is what you enjoy, that's what we're here to do today. And we're definitely not going to put like an absolute tier list on any of these combinations or any of these base classes at all. That's up for you to decide. There are some classes that have an easier time soloing things, but there are some classes that have an easier time grouping up with this other specific combination to walk right through a lot of the stuff that stands in your way. Okay, so those are some of the things we're going to discuss, but whether or not you want to play that way, that's completely up to you. I think this is such a wonderful project that you should experience it in whatever way you want to experience it in, and I'm just trying to facilitate those experiences that you're going to have with this game. You're going to have a lot of fun. You can see here I have a bunch of classes created. Some of them I haven't even played past level 30. Some of them I haven't played at all. That I've I'm just kind of have them sitting over to the side that I'm maybe going to try them out in the future. So the character you're looking at right here, this is my main He's got some titles that I'm not 100% sure if they're exclusive to just me, but there's one that I think I might be the only person that has. I'm not 100% sure. I've looked through it. I'm not a guide for the game. I'm not on the stream team. I'm not a developer. I am just a regular old player. So from what they've told me, I might even have a title on my main character that nobody else has. And it's for doing silly, stupid stuff. It's not for like any kind of crazy achievement or whatever, but it just kind of, I think, accentuates what I'm saying in that you can do whatever you want to do and you can still accomplish almost everything on your own, right? So I just picked the three classes that I liked the most in the game for my main. I played it. I really enjoyed it. I've played a bunch of other classes. I have enjoyed a lot of other class combinations, but I still don't enjoy them as much as I enjoy this combination here. And that's Bard Rogue Magician, as you can see. So when I first started playing the game as a young kid, the first character, I actually started helping my friend play his character because I couldn't have it. I was like 13 or 14 at the time, so I couldn't get an account. I had no credit card. My parents wouldn't, Eventually, I was able to get my own account. But the first character I was able to make on my friend's account and play as my own character was a rogue. Okay, so I played that character for vanilla and a little bit in Kunark and so on. And then after that, in Velios, I played a few different characters. I played an enchanter that a friend of mine left behind. I played a bard. I played a magician. And I had fun playing a lot of those classes. I played a warrior in Planes of Power for a while. And then I left the game. I played Warcraft for a while, and then I came back several years later. I played in the Seeds of Destruction, Secrets of Fedor era. I played a bard there, and I had a lot of fun. And these are just the three classes I had the most fun playing in the history of playing the game. So that's what my main is. Before we want to dive in, I just want to give you some of my credentials as well, just so you know that I'm not a person that dives into the code of the game, but I do love numbers. I love algorithms. I like figuring things out. I love diving in, learning a lot of stuff. This character does have capped alternate experience points. So if you are familiar with the game, you know what those are. If you're not, check out my primer, but also check out a lot of other people's primers on the game. And I would say you want to learn a lot more about the game and how things work before you continue watching this. Pause this, check out some of that stuff, and then come on back when you're done. Because this video is going to assume that you know a lot of that stuff already. And just real quick, what alternate advancement is and what makes Everquest unique is once you get to max level or at any point during your journey leveling up, you can take a little toggle switch and say, I want to send all the experience that I'm gaining while I kill enemies and turn in quests and so on to my alternate experience pool. And what that does is every time you get enough alternate experience or experience sent to the alternate experience pool, you get an alternate experience ability point, or an AA point for short. And there are all sorts of extra abilities that you can buy with these points. So instead of like a skill tree or like specializations that you may think of from, I don't know, World of Warcraft, Dark Age of Camelot, Final Fantasy 11 and 14, Star Wars Old Republic, and so on and so forth. This is Everquest's answer to those skill trees and choices, right? Basically what they do is say, hey, you can keep leveling even though you're max level, or maybe you want to stop at level 30 or 35, 50, whatever. And you can level up all these alternate abilities that you can go ahead and purchase and add into your character. You can get extra run speed, extra HP regen, and all sorts of archetype and class specific stuff. Like maybe your DOT damage spells do more damage. Maybe if you're a tank, maybe you can do more blocking with your shield, and you take less damage when you have a shield equipped, and so on down the line. So those are my credentials. I have that's kind of like what's going on. My credentials are, and not only do this character have maxed AAs, which is about 4,700 plus AA. Across the other characters I have, as you can see in my little character select screen here, I have about 10,000, I think 11,000 or something total across all characters. So I have a lot of experience playing with other characters and theory crafting and all that. And as of yesterday evening, I have completed all content in the game on a duo experience, and most content solo. I have not completed Sanctus Seru solo higher than um, the 2 out of 4, which will not sound like, if you're not familiar with what that means, don't worry about it. But a friend and I last night were able to complete Plane of Time, which is the last zone in the Planes of Power expansion. And I talk about it a little bit in the primer before this, but I think the reason that I'm kind of coming to the forefront and trying to make this now is that now that we're here in Planes of Power, we've had the several expansions before this. I really love the direction of where this is going. I trust the developers that are making this, and I feel comfortable coming out and endorsing this, like, experience as a whole to anybody out there, whether or not you've experienced EverQuest or not, right? So that's where we're at. I'm not saying I know more than people. There are plenty of people that if you give them a spreadsheet and a bunch of data to calc, they'll do a much better job than me. There are plenty of people out there that are better than me at putting these different classes together and so on and so forth. What I want to do is I just kind of want to give you a brief overview of each class, how they can work and synergize with some of the other classes, where some of them may need a little bit of help, where some of them have a really, really high performance, and so on. And we're going to leave that open because the way that this works, with the way that the developers take care of their server, is that if a class is struggling, they will often try to tune some stuff upwards and help it out a bit. And if there's some classes that are just blasting through content without any thought or having to use tactics or skill to beat it, they will try to tune it down. And a real quick example is a lot of the classes that summon pets have been a little bit overpowered, especially when combined with each other, throughout the existence of this new concept of the 3 classes at the same time idea. And there's been some other classes that have really suffered a bit because when you're a jack of all trades class like Druid, it's very difficult for you to find a space to be very highly contributing to what the player wants to do with you, because when I can pick 3 classes and combine them, the jack of all trades class kind of loses what makes it its own thing, which is being able to do everything. If I can pick 3 classes, one that can tank, one that can heal, and one that can do a bunch of damage, why do I need a jack of all trades class? I just don't. So those things will be adjusted as we move forward, and if we need to remake this video, we will remake it a few times. Any patch can change things and completely change the way a class functions. It can reduce its ability, it can increase its ability. Those are natural events that happen in the game like this in the life cycle of the thing, right? So we're just going to go ahead and dive right in. We're going to review everything, and I will jump around a little bit because I like to talk about some archetypes closer to others. I think it makes more sense than just going through the list and having to circle back. So we'll go ahead and talk about archetypes and the MMO kind of standard Holy Trinity. So in RPGs in general, but especially MMOs, there exists a kind of triangle or Holy Trinity or whatever you want to call it of archetypes. And those archetypes are tank, which is the class that can absorb a lot of the damage that the big baddies are putting out. Then there's the healer. This is the person or class that is going to make sure that your tank doesn't die and that your damage dealers or whatever don't die, and they're gonna buff you up, they're gonna heal you, they're gonna resurrect you if you die, all sorts of other stuff like that. And then you have your DPS classes, which is the classes that are going to do all the damage, way more so than the tank or the healer are going to do, to make sure that the enemies that you're fighting actually get defeated and you get the nice sweet loot that you want at the end, right? So those are the 3 big archetypes. Now, some of these archetypes have subsections. It depends on what game you're playing. In EverQuest, it's pretty cut and dry. There's not too much of a difference. If you were to say, look at a Final Fantasy XIV, they do a very, very targeted job of separating the melee damage dealers from the range damage dealers, and their functionality is very, very different. In EverQuest, range damage is not that different from each other. Almost all range damage is magical outside of the actual ranger who uses a bow. And then all of the melee damage is effectively very similar. It's just about how do you maneuver in melee to get your melee damage in. Um, the gimmicks between the classes are way more nuanced and subtle than they are very obvious and overt as the way modern games would approach this. Okay, so a lot of the classes we're going to talk about um, will have a lot more nuance difference than overt difference, if that makes sense to you guys, right? So this was back; these classes were made back in the day when you know everyone was hyper focused and developers were not as concerned with giving the players as many tools needed to complete the job no matter who was available to them. They just assumed you would be able to get 60 people together or 90 people together and do a big giant raid. And as video game moved forward, with that number reduced to 25, it reduced to 10, it reduced to a single group. And here on the hero's journey, you can do a lot of stuff with just on your own, by yourself. And the triple class kind of system, enables that, right? So let's just go right down the line. We're going to go straight to tanks. We're going to start with the most basic tank that's available. That's the warrior. Now, you'll get a little synopsis of like what's going on with the warrior over here, but it's just kind of like a fluff article. It doesn't really tell you exactly what they're up to. All right, so what can warriors do? Warriors can dual wield. They can use shields. They can use two-handed weapons. They can wear plate mail, and they don't have any mana. They don't cast any spells whatsoever. Um, every non-spellcasting and even some spellcasting classes in this game have access to what's called disciplines at a later level. There's an alternate resource called stamina, which funnels these disciplines to be used. Back in the day, stamina had a lot more uses. Like you would lose stamina if you weren't eating and drinking food. These are like more like old school D&D type concepts that were in the game at the beginning, but as the developers moved forward, they realized the players really weren't here for that kind of thing, and they kind of moved away from those things. If you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons or any kind of tabletop game in your life, you may have experienced somebody running the game saying, "Don't worry about eating and drinking. That happens off screen. It's like a movie. Obviously, everybody has to go to the bathroom. Obviously, everybody takes a shower. Obviously, everybody eats a dinner. Don't worry about it." That's kind of how the game, moved forward. And that's where we are with that, right? So the stamina meter is in game. Every character has it. However, it just isn't used by most of the spell casting classes. It is, however, used by all of the classes that either don't cast spells or are some kind of hybrid of a warrior plus a spellcaster or some kind of like interesting unique thing on their own, like the berserker or the rogue that are melee DPS that don't have any mana as well, and they use a lot of stamina to use these disciplines, right? So warriors get all sorts of cool stuff. They get the ability to use a shield and a weapon and tank a lot better than most classes. They're the only class in the game that gets an area of effect taunt, which is basically a button you can press and you taunt everything to attack you in an area. Other classes get single target taunts. They might get spells that they can cast as a taunt, but warrior is the only class that gets an ability that you can just press this and bam, no mana cost, no casting time. I'm just taunting you. They get all sorts of other cool stuff like some abilities that auto proc weapons. If you're not familiar with what procking a weapon is, I have a sword of flames. When I attack you with a sword of flames, there's a chance that the sword of flames burns you, right? And so what warriors get is they get some abilities that let them uh, make that sword burn you more often, or automatically make it happen on every swing that lands in a certain amount of time, right? They're very versatile, often slept on, because actually the way that generating aggro or threat, whatever you like to call it, basically the hatred that the enemies have for you, so they attack you first before anyone else, the way that the warrior functions, they don't actually generate as much single target threat or aggro that some of the other tank classes can. But they make up for this by doing a bunch of extra melee damage and then they sacrifice their spellcasting utility. So warrior is a really interesting class. It can complement other melee attackers very well. It can be used to add up a lot of defensive skill to another combination. It's also interesting because if you're overwhelmed by all the different spells you may cast, you can add warrior to a couple spellcasters to give yourself a little defensive ability and give you some melee threat when you're either out of mana or that so you don't get overwhelmed with 3 different spellcasters amount of casting spells. Everquest, if you are a veteran, you'll know only certain spells can be saved and used at once, right? You can't cast spells randomly out of your whole spell book. You have to prepare them, and you basically have to say, okay, these are the 12 spells that I have memorized at the time, and these are the ones that I can cast, and I have to sit down and be in a vulnerable state and unmemorize one and memorize a new one before I can cast it, right? So there's all sorts of cool stuff like that. Warrior can absolutely reduce your mental stack if you apply it to certain combinations. Really great class. It's in a good space right now. Often underestimated by a lot of people who play this game. And again, they can use all sorts of different gear. Like I mentioned, they wear plate mail. You can add this to characters that would not otherwise be able to wear this heavy armor, and you can all of a sudden put all this heavy armor on, and you can do a lot of cool stuff. You can also evade a lot of damage. You can mitigate a lot of damage. Just really interesting, unique take on how to be like the tank, but also do a lot of interesting damage in the same time. Let's now skip up to the paladin. This is like the holy knight version of the warrior, and it's basically like half of a warrior but half of a cleric who like heals people and stuns enemies, turns undead, is like the good, paragon of virtue or whatever. Basically what the paladin's going to do is pretty similar to the warrior. However, the paladin by itself cannot dual wield weapons like the warrior can. The paladin can use a two-handed weapon, it can use a sword and a shield, um, but it cannot actually dual wield 2 weapons at the same time. You'd have to take another class that has the ability to dual wield, and then to give them that as well. Now, Paladin makes up for this with a lot of stuff. They make up for this by casting a little bit lower level of cleric spells that clerics can cast. They have some of their own unique spells. They have a few unique abilities. The first one's going to be the Lay on Hands, which is instantly heal you or anyone else you want to target by a giant margin with a little bit longer of a cooldown. And then they have all sorts of cool other interesting stuff. They share those same alternate advancement abilities the warrior does with using a sword and shield, doing a bunch of extra damage. They have a few other additional abilities that allow them to always have a chance to heal themselves and everyone else in the party whenever they attack something in melee. They have the ability, like warriors, to become immune to certain status effects. And they have a lot of other intricate cooldowns that will help protect the party members, heal them. You can even sacrifice yourself to heal somebody else to completely to full. Your character literally dies, but you heal someone else to full life. Now, not so much of a useful ability in a solo, duo, 3-person group environment, but really massively useful in like a big raid environment. So if you think about back in the day when there's 90 people and the main tank of the raid is about to go down and the healers can't heal them quick enough, a paladin can make that holy sacrifice and sacrifice himself to keep that person alive, right? So very thematic. Paladins have been buffed several times since the launch of the server because they generate a lot of threat. They're almost unkillable if you know what you're doing, but they just don't do a whole lot of damage on their own. So they really want to be paired with another damage dealing class or two to really get that solo, like Holy Knight kind of thing going on. Again, great class. Doesn't need a whole lot of help right now. If you commit to that sword and shield style, you'll definitely see a lot of success. If you're going to do a little bit of dual wielding or two-handed kind of work, you really have to pick the right classes to pair with them to make that work, but it's absolutely still viable. And it's just an interesting class. They have all kinds of weird, unique stuff that only paladins get, like I mentioned, and also maybe the marquee ability is called Slay Undead, which means when they run into a zone and they attack something that's undead, they just do way more damage to it than anyone else does, and they just blitzkrieg. It's done, right? However, this is actually so good. The developers have changed some zones that used to be full of undead creatures to not be. because paladins would just run through it for free. So that's how kind of tilting of the scales they can be. You might see paladins are a little bit underpowered if you talk to other people, but then you'll also see other people saying, hey, they're underpowered, or maybe they are underpowered. We really don't know. They're pretty balanced right now, but if some of these zones weren't changed and they were full of undead mobs, yeah, paladins would just be walking through these things for free. Bosses would be dying in 7 or 8 rounds of attacks. Paladins would just be crushing them, right? So if you want to play a Holy Knight or whatever, or some kind of combination of that, Paladins for you, it's a great class. It's very balanced right now. Highly recommend it. Okay, next to the other third and probably most marquee tank class. These are like the 3 main tank classes. We have the Shadow Knight, and this is the exact opposite of the Paladin in theme, but very similar in terms of functionality. Okay, so the Paladin, instead of being able to heal itself with cleric spells and being able to stun enemies and turn undead and all that, they embrace the dark side. They kind of they have life steal where they drain their opponent's souls. They have skeleton pets that are summoned. They're basically necromancers combined with the warrior, as opposed to clerics combined with the warrior. And they do all the same things. They have all the similar functionality. They don't slay undead, but they do have the ability to add an extra life tap proc to their weapon. So when they attack you, not only are they able to cast a life draining spell on you, but their weapon will also be able to potentially activate a life draining ability as well, in addition to any other effects that it has, and keep them staying in the fight. They do a lot more damage than paladins do, but they're spiky. And what I mean by spiky is when you have 100% of your HP, you can get hit very hard and you can lose half of your HP in a single round of combat. And paladins will often evade that damage. They'll block a lot of that damage. They'll mitigate that damage, and they'll only maybe lose 20% of your health. Well, Shadow Knights are going to lose a lot more than paladins will. However, they will usually have a lot of ways to gain that health back while continuing to do damage to their enemies. So a little bit of the give and take between these two is that your paladin is going to take a lot less damage, but do a lot less damage. Your Shadow Knight's going to take a lot more damage, but they're going to do a lot more damage and then heal themselves back up. And, there's just different things you've got to look out for when you're playing these classes and fighting enemies. Some enemies will be able to hit you really hard, but they won't be able to do you a lot of spell damage. Some enemies won't hit you very hard, but they'll be resistant to a lot of spell damage. So they might be a lot harder for Shadow Knights to get overcome, might be easier for Paladins to overcome, and vice versa. So this is another great class. They have the exact opposite ability of the Paladin. They have what's called a Harm Touch, which is the opposite of Lay on Hands. It's pick an enemy and blast them for a bunch of damage with a really long cooldown, in addition to all the other stuff that they borrow from the Necromancer spellcasting class, right? So this is another great tank. This adds a lot of functionality. Same as Paladin, they cannot dual wield on their own, but if you add a class that can dual wield, you will eventually be able to have them to dual wield instead of using a single weapon and a shield or a two-handed weapon. Shadow Knights don't have what the Warrior and Paladins have, which is a bunch of extra damage for using a shield as well. So you'll oftentimes will not see a Shadow Knight with a shield as much as you'll see a Warrior or Paladin trifecta with a shield. But they do have a lot of the immunities, such as immunity to stun and fear. They can buy later in the game, similar to Warrior and Paladin. And, again, they're one of the favorite classes for soloing content because those life taps that drain the enemy's HP, do damage, and heal you back without you having to do a whole lot, without you having to stop attacking to cast a heal spell on yourself. Those are just naturally easier things to do when you're attacking the enemy and you're solo, and you just by just attacking, you're going to heal yourself and mitigate a lot of damage. So, again, great class to play. Oftentimes, it's super fun to add to any other combination. Highly recommend checking them out. They're a lot of fun and really just like a thematic masterpiece, really. All right. So, there is a couple other classes that wear plate mail, but they really don't do the job of tanking. So now what I want to do for you is I want to jump towards healers, because damage dealers, like I mentioned at the top, are very different and varied. But when it comes to healers, healing classes are pretty straightforward, and it's kind of just easier to get them out of the way before we get into all the subtle nuances of all the different damage dealers that are in the game. So let's jump on up to the Cleric. The Cleric is the standard priest healer type class. They do exactly what you think they do. They heal you over time. They heal you for big heals up front. They buff your characters. They buff your party members with extra hit points and extra armor and strength and all sorts of stuff like that. They also um, have a bunch of unique vulnerabilities that they share with paladins. You know, paladins will just cast them at a lower level and things like that to get you out of sticky situations. They have, again, anti-undead mechanics. They don't have the slay undead ability that the paladins do to like really burn down melee attackers, but they have turn undead, which they can use to stun undead and kind of set them up for the damage dealers in their party to finish them off. And clerics are just absolutely invaluable. In the old school game, clerics were absolutely necessary to do all content. There was no way to keep tanks alive with guaranteed success without having a bunch of clerics lining up in a row and just healing your tank over and over. Well, in the Hero's Journey, they have a lot more stuff to offer because in the base game, they have a lot of extra cooldown abilities, healing totems. They can summon hammers to attack the enemy. Clerics can de facto in emergency tank a lot of damage while the group or the raid or whoever recovers. What's interesting is that since you don't really have a full group or even a full raid in this expansion of the idea of how to play, you can actually apply a lot of their abilities in combination with other melee attacking classes. A lot of clerics are added in to warrior combinations, to berserker combinations, to monk combinations, these classes that do a bunch of damage, and they utilize the cleric's ability to add a bunch of strength and healing and other utility through their own melee stuff that wouldn't really be all that impressive as just a cleric. But when you add a whole nother melee class that normally doesn't have access to these things, the cleric then really, really shines through. You'll see lots of cool combinations, like I mentioned with monk, berserker, warrior, the beast lord, the ranger, all sorts of cool combinations you can do with the cleric to really squeeze all of the potential out of what they can do, and to keep yourself super safe, keep yourself healed up, and do a lot of soloing because you can actually sit around and go, oh, this mob's attacking me for a lot of damage. But right now, I'm really low health. Well, let me just stop attacking, heal myself up to full, laugh at the mob that can't do anything to interrupt any of my spells because any heal on yourself cast on the server now is not interruptible. And then you can just go back to swinging. So there's all sorts of cool combinations. Where I wouldn't pair a cleric with is I wouldn't pair a cleric with, say, a Shadow Knight, which we already talked about, because they kind of already are healing themselves. But other than that, they kind of pair well with almost everybody. There's a lot of cool synergies with them and warriors. One of the most classic combinations you'll see on this server is you'll see warrior, cleric, X, which could be beast lord, could be ranger, berserker, or whatever, because the warrior has the ability to give your weapons a lot of procs. Clerics have a lot of cleric only or caster only weapons that have really good procs, like effects that happen when you attack with your weapon. And they just really synergize really well. Clerics have some auto procking stuff as well. Not at the level of Beast Lord and Warrior, but like at a very, like kind of similar, like getting that extra efficiency out of those things. And clerics, again, great class, no notes, awesome. Definitely check them out if you have the inclination to do so. Let's jump around a little bit here. Let's go to the next healer. And I don't believe I can pick him on this race, so I'm going to switch real quick. Let's go to the shaman. Okay, so what makes the shaman different from the cleric? Well, the shaman has all sorts of really good heals, but where the shaman really excels are the buffs. The shaman has the best buffs in the game. They can buff themselves, they can buff people's pets. They have their own pet, but their pet's pretty weak. And they can also just the versatility of all the buffs. Not only do they have the best buffs, they have the most buffs. Do you need some hit points? Shaman's going to give it to you. You need some attack speed? Got you, no problem. You need some strength or some agility, some dexterity? Shaman's got a buff for that, don't worry. Oh, and on top of that, they've got some damage over time spells that are really, really tough. Then, what else is super important? Not getting smashed by enemies that you're attacking. Well, guess what shamans have? Shamans have the best and most efficient slows, attack speed reduction spells in the game that you can use on enemies to make sure you don't get your head caved in, right? So shamans are one of these amazing spellcasting classes. They're absolutely incredible. You always want a bunch of shamans whenever you're going after a big raid kill because you want guys to be slowed if they're slowable. You want all your friends to be buffed, and you want somebody who can heal you up and that can put a bunch of damage over time, which are easy, free damage spells that the shaman can throw up at the beginning of the fight and then not have to worry about it afterwards. Set it and forget it, as they say, and then concentrate on making sure everybody else is really good, staying alive, and all that. So shamans really, really excel at almost every aspect of casting. They're one of the best classes in the game. They get overlooked all the time. You combine a shaman with another utility class and a melee class, or like a tank class and a melee class. They're just doing all sorts of great work. Shadow Knight Rogue Shaman, Shadow Knight Bard Shaman are some of the best solo classes in the game if you don't count like some of the pet combinations. And shamans just really do all sorts of cool stuff. They have amazing survivability cooldowns you can buy later in the game. They can turn into a bear and be almost unkillable as a paladin for a little while. If you combine paladin and shaman together, I mean, you can tank almost anything for like 30 minutes. It's absolutely nuts. So definitely check out shaman if you can. They're awesome, and their heals are not like by any means any lacking. Like they've got pretty good heals as well. Really fun spellcasting class, healer. Check them out. All right, let's jump back over here and let's talk about the other healer, the other main healer of the three healers. Just like there's three tanks, the druid. Now, I think druid is a lot of fun. The problem with druid is, like I said at the top, the druid was designed to be the jack of all trades class in the game. So unfortunately, when you change the way the game works and you let people pick and combine three classes together, any jack of all trades class is going to lose a lot of their utility because players will just have that utility naturally. If I can play a warrior and a cleric and a beast lord, which is the warrior shaman hybrid we'll talk about later, or well, it's more of a monk shaman hybrid, but we'll talk about that later as well. All of a sudden now I have attacks, I have tankiness, I have slows and hastes, I have a pet, I have all these heals. Why do I need to play a druid? And unfortunately, that's kind of the biggest knock against druid. Now, that being said, druids are excelling at a lot of things that right now the game doesn't take advantage of, but very well could be positioned to take advantage of in the future. They have some really cool AAs that give them some of the best damage shields in the game. If you're not familiar with what the damage shield is, it's when an enemy attacks you. Every time they attack you and hit you, they get burned or skewered by thorns, or they hit your hard metal skin and they damage themselves or something like that. Really useful in the early game, but unfortunately it just doesn't scale into the late game as much because the harder enemies hit you in a single hit, the damage shield's only doing the same amount of damage for each hit. And the way the game works and enemy scale up is oftentimes either the enemies can be slowed, which means they're not taking as much damage as your damage shield will put out, or they didn't do a bunch of little attacks, they just do the same amount of attacks and they hit you harder. And damage shields don't scale up with how hard you get hit, they only apply for each time you get hit. But druids have damage over time spells, they have heals, they have a very unique set of abilities to teleport you all around the map. Not as important with the hero's journey, which has the transporter stuff implemented, but still useful. They have the ability Succor, which is a spell that evacuates you to a very safe point in any zone that can oftentimes not only save your rear end from getting wrecked, but it can save you a lot of travel time. You can run across the other end of the zone, you can camp something that drops, and then you can teleport back to this safe point in the zone and then go into a zone to the north instead of going all the way back to our main commerce area and then teleporting all the way back a couple zones away to the next place you have to go. So druids have a lot of utility. The problem is everyone has a lot of utility right now. And there's nothing that druids have that really sets them apart and makes them unique at the moment. But in the future, they could absolutely be leveraged to become much better than they are right now. And there are some very unique combinations with druid that make a lot of sense. If you want some heals and you want some damage over time spells, but you're getting your haste, from somewhere else, you're not interested in using pets all that much, like say you're using a bard and then something else, and then you want some heals and damage over time spells in addition to the bard's damage over time spells, druid might actually be for you. You can stack up a bunch of damage shields that you cast along with a bunch of damage shields from the bard that you sing, and they all stack together. There's all sorts of interesting opportunities. Druids have some unique weapons that are interesting very early that only they and rangers can use that you can leverage. But really, unfortunately for druids right now, it's just not the druid era, and it really hasn't been the druid era ever since. I really hope they get a big buff in the coming weeks, but we're going to hold out hope for that. One saving grace for the druid, though, is that since they have really good DOTs, they're a little bit better than shamans in most scenarios. And since they have some pretty competent direct damage nukes, which the wizard excels at the most, if you can combine a druid with another spellcaster that does a lot of damage, like mage or wizard, right? And then you combine them with the enchanter class, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The enchanter has an ability to create clones of you. And those clones of you, while the cooldown is happening, will cast a bunch of extra spells that you have memorized and that you kind of like set up for them to cast. So with the druid, if you combine them with another really high damage spellcaster and the enchanter, you can actually put out a lot of ranged magic damage, with also having a bunch of extra utility you wouldn't normally have, because your cleric and your shaman don't really have great direct damage spells. The cleric has some stuns that do a little bit of damage. The shaman has a couple of direct damage spells that are okay, but the druid has much better direct damage spells. Shamans and druids' DOT damage, the damage over time spells, are very close, very similar. But the druid adds more direct damage on top of that, a little bit more utility and maneuverability, right? So if you combine them with another spell damage caster and you combine them with enchanter, you can sort of set up this nasty salvo of ranged magic damage that just blows people out. And, it can work. So druid, it's still a good class. It can still do all the content if you combine it with two other classes and you make a really nice synergistic combination. It's just a little bit harder to find synergy with druid because they are the jack of all trades, and you're going to be combining three classes together anyway, like we covered already. So druids, hopefully the big buffs in the future, they're okay. If I had to put any class at the very bottom, they'd probably be right there. But, we're talking about giving classes A pluses, A's, A minuses, and B's, right? Like the druid's just a B in a game full of A pluses. That's all. They're not bad. They're just a little bit worse than everyone else, and I think they're going to get huge buffs soon. So hold out for druids if you want to play one. Or, again, like I said at the top, play one and have a great time because you love druid. You'll still be able to do all the stuff you want to do outside of maybe the top 1% of things that you can always find friends with and complete anyway. Okay, those are the three main healers out of the way. Let's cover a couple hybrids real quick that kind of apply to what the classes we just talked about. So let's go to the Beast Lord. I mentioned them a little bit earlier. The Beast Lord is a combination between the Shaman, who we already talked about, and the Monk damaging class. Monks are like a hand-to-hand flying kick, hi-ya type damage class. We'll talk about them in a little bit. But Beast Lords are mostly, only pulling from the monk the weapons that they use and the kind of that kind of stuff. Everything else that they want to do really comes from the shaman. So they have a lot of the damage over time spells that the shamans have. They have a lot of heals that the shamans have. They have a lot of buffs that the shamans have. They have some unique buffs that only Beast Lords have. They have a much stronger pet than the shaman has. It helps the shaman, or helps the Beast Lord out in combat. And the Beast Lord also has some really cool and interesting melee damage cooldown abilities you can buy that are more close to the warrior than the monk or the shaman. They have an auto-procking attack, which is really great. It'll say that this weapon that has a special effect that has a percentage chance to happen when you attack something. This weapon in my offhand, they dual wield as well, has a chance to attack they're going to hit every single. So for this 12 seconds, every time I attack and I hit, the extra effect on my weapon is happening, and that can lead to some really interesting combinations. One of the more popular combinations. It's lost a little bit of favor in the last few months, but it's still very, very strong. My friend plays one to a very high level, and we were able to beat the end game boss of the current content, and playing the time with him as warrior, cleric, beast lord, and me as my interesting, weird combination. Right? Great, great you can gather up a whole set of enemies, and as long as you have one weapon that steals health and another weapon that does AoE damage, you can just gather up like a half a zone or a whole zone's worth of enemies and just blitz them all down, in like 30 seconds with all your cool, amazingly good cooldown abilities you can buy. And they have all sorts of other interesting stuff, little healing totems and so on and so forth. So Beast Lord, very interesting class. Opens up a lot of unique gear as well that are only for monks and only for Beast Lords. Hand-to-hand weapons that have interesting effects, and other cool stuff. Armor that is designed just for them, that has a lot of extra agility, which helps them avoid a lot of damage, as opposed to just soaking a lot of damage with stamina. Often overlooked. Agility is a very important stat. It was one of the least important stats in live EverQuest for a long time. But when you come to a server where there's only 2 or 3 of you and one of you has to take all the damage, agility does a lot of heavy lifting and helping you avoid taking a lot of damage. So check that out with monks and beast lords especially. Beast Lord, A++, awesome class. Definitely check them out in some shape or form. And one of the cool, unique things about the Beast Lord is, depending on which race your character is, their pet changes based on what race that your character is, which is really cool. Something unique that no other pet class experiences in the entire game, right? So if you're a high elf Beast Lord, you get a dragon pet. If you're like a halfling Beast Lord, you get like a snake that slithers around, or whatever. Yeah, it's really cool. They kind of like had to figure out what races get what, because only certain races could be Beast Lord. But now in this expansion, if you pick like say a troll, and or whatever, you have a pet, right? It's whatever. But then you switch to Wood Elf, who can't be Beast Lord. What if I'm a Wood Elf and I become a Beast Lord? What pet do I get then? So I'm gonna leave those little Easter eggs in the game for you to find out and see what pets you get when you pick a race that's not normally a Beast Lord and you have a Beast Lord pet. But yeah, really cool. Love this class. It was one of the ones that's added a bit later than other classes, and it really benefited from having a few years of design before they kind of dove in and gave it a lot of the unique stuff. And it's doing really well. I love Beast Lord. Check them out. Okay, and then one more hybrid class real quick before we move on to the damage dealers is the Ranger. The Ranger is your typical bow. I'm going to use my bow and shoot people in the face with my bow from way over here, and I'm going to win. That's how I'm going to do it. And EverQuest is no exception to that. That's exactly what Rangers do in this game. One thing though that makes Rangers in EverQuest vastly different than Rangers and Hunters, or whatever you want to call them in other games, is that as a Ranger, you can stand in melee combat. You can draw that bowstring back, and you can tap somebody right in the face, point blank. Rangers don't need to keep people off of them at all. They can just shoot you right in the face with a bow, standing in melee combat, which is huge. Normally, if you were playing a Ranger, it wouldn't be that big of a deal, and there's not really a reason to stand in melee combat. But when you can add 2 more classes to your Ranger, that becomes a giant wide open door that you can just walk through and do all sorts of weird stuff with, right? You can add a bard to get a bunch of extra utility. You can add a cleric to get better healing. As a Ranger, you get a little bit of druid spells here and there. You're kind of like a half warrior, half druid hybrid with a focus on the bow. But also you get a lot of unique stuff. You get extra little procs that you can add, buffs that you can add to your weapon attacks, similar to the Shadow Knight adding the life tap proc to their weapon. There's a lot of other interesting things. You have a little bit better of a pet than a shaman or a druid could summon. But really is focused on the bow and doing a lot of damage with the bow and like special arrows and all that stuff. And Ranger has a very interesting way you can play them. You can switch to melee and melee. You can just continue attacking to the bow. It's up to you, whatever you want to do. Sometimes, depending on what classes you pick, you can pick really cool like focus objects to use in your hands instead of melee weapons, and you can just keep shooting with the bow over and over again at extra speed. The bow is actually an interesting weapon as well because any range weapon in this game, the way that the extra effects attack the enemies when you use bow attacks, it's different from when you use melee weapons. So when you use a melee weapon, there's a completely different way that melee weapon attacks calculate if those extra effects are going to happen, proc, if you will. And bows use a different equation that actually like lets those things happen on every single shot instead of attacks per round or whatever. So you can actually leverage, again, the bard who has a bonus chance to proc. You can leverage the bard. You can leverage other classes that add procs to your weapons, like Shadow Knight, like cleric, and stuff like that. And you could really get some really interesting combinations with the ranger. Rangers were poo-pooed a lot in the beginning, before people really dove into theorycrafted, and now they're some of the best damage in the game, depending on like what you're doing. If you can stay a little further away and not even take damage and not even have to worry about things, you can go all in on damage, right? So like if you're standing in melee range of a boss that like can turn to you and smash you with a rampage attack, or that can cast a point blank AoE spell that does a bunch of damage, well, you have to really worry about staying alive and healing yourself. And if you're a solo or you have a duo partner or even a group of three, sometimes the survivability comes into question. But if you do have a group of people and you're a ranger XX, whatever combination, and you can stand 300 meters back and just pop, 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 standing back even further than a wizard or a mage can stand, a nuke, and just be shooting all day long, I mean, you can do a total stack of damage without even having any risk of coming anywhere near dying. And that just becomes very, very interesting. And, like it can be really, really, really strong. So, Rangers, definitely another great class to check them out. A different, unique way to play the game, way more unique way to play the game as a ranger in Everquest and say a range damage dealer and say like a Final Fantasy 14, where all range damage dealers, even the spellcasters, kind of are up to the same thing. Rangers are unique in this game. No one else kind of really does the way range damage formula, the way that the ranger does it. Okay, let's move on to our melee class. I'm going to jump back over here to human. First and foremost, my favorite class, the Bard. Sing along, sing your songs. Bards, obviously, here we go, right? I mean, they sing songs instead of cast spells. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of the Bard in all the different media. You've maybe seen it on TV. You've played one in D&D. You've heard of it, right? So bards are going to basically sing songs, which are a little bit different than casting spells. And what those songs are going to do is buff your party, bring detrimental effects to your enemies, do some damage, all sorts of stuff like that. They do have mana, like every other spellcaster, but they don't use it in the same way. Okay? Bards also have a decent melee ability. They have a bunch of unique stuff, like I mentioned before. Bards have an innate chance added on to proc weapon effects that they are attacking. They get a lot more weapon procking bonus AAs as well. Abilities you can buy to make the weapons proc more often that a lot of other classes just don't get. And if you used it in combination with some of these classes that have exclusive weapons that only those classes can use, you can get some really crazy good proc chains going with the Bard. They do a lot of other things too, like run really fast. They have movement speed stuff that increases. They're faster than anybody else. They get a base movement speed increase, 10% faster than everyone else. And they get all sorts of cool cooldowns. They summon allies. They buff them up, and then they send them in. And then, they have all sorts of cool other items that buff people up. And they also add a really good amount of damage in melee combat. They can dual wield. They can also use two-handed weapons, but you'll almost never see that. Unless, like you pair up a bard with a ranger and you're using your bow. It just doesn't usually happen often. They have a little bit extra bonus to dual wield and, more attacks than your average hybrid character will. But not as many as, like, say, the rogue or the monk will. Pure damage, no mana type classes. Bard's my favorite class in the game. It has been for most of the entire time I've been playing. I love it, and I highly recommend playing it. Bard has seen a lot of upgrades on the Hero's Journey server. So the Bard songs used to be where you'd have to play them. They would last for about 18 seconds and take about 3.5 seconds to cast, and then you'd have to just be rotating your songs all day long. This was, a lot of manual dexterity, a lot of carpal tunnel involved here, and eventually what they did was they put in a command where you could say it was called melody, and that still exists in the game. You can type /melody, and you can pick the number of spells in your spell list that you want to cast on a repeat kind of like playlist, if you will, and you'll cast those over and over and over again unless you get interrupted or you manually stop it or whatever. Well, THJ has taken that one step further. That melody situation still exists for any kind of detrimental spells that you'd like to cast on opponents or in an area, around opponents or around yourself. But any beneficial group songs that you want to cast, if you cast them once in the zone that you're in, until you leave the zone or log out and log back in or whatever, as long as that spell stays in your memorized spell gems, spell slots, basically, it will just persist as it were a regular buff. So if I cast my haste song and make all of us attack faster, I only have to cast it once, finish singing it, it's applied, and as long as I let that haste song sit in my spell list, it will just be there and on. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, wait, can I cast like 5 or 6 of my songs that buff up my party and then load up like 4 of my songs that like do detrimental stuff to my opponent? And can I do both singing the melody where I cast the detrimental songs in a row and then I can cast all? Yeah, you could do that. You absolutely can do that. And it does work. Okay. You can absolutely load up 6 buffs, 7 buffs, sing them all, and then run into the fight and take 4 more spells that slow your opponent, that snare them, that fear them, that reduce their resistance. You can take songs that cure yourself of curses and all that, or whatever. And you can line them. You can take all the Bard's damage over time stuff and just rip damage over times on the enemy over and over again while you're singing all your buffs. It is an interesting and fun way to play, and it's awesome. Highly recommend Bard. One of my favorite class, and a class I recommend everybody messes around with, especially on this server because of how upgraded the quality of life of playing the Bard is. And it makes it so much easier to play the Bard along with other spellcasters, right? So you can be a wizard and you can cast 3 or 4 like big damage nukes while you're also playing your mana regen and your damage absorbs and all that stuff on the side without even having to hit any of the buttons after the first time you hit them. Bard, awesome. Love the Bard. Okay, let's go to the other melee DPSs here. Next, we've got the Monk. Monk's your typical, punch him in the face with my fists, kick him in the nuts with my flying kicks type of class. That's what they do, right? They come out, they put out a bunch of extra attacks. So you got like flying kick and dragon punch and all this other stuff. You're throwing out extra kicks. They have the ability. Let me go back to Bard for 1 second. One thing that Bards do that's very unique that Monks also do is they are traditionally classes that can pull enemies to the group and separate big packs of enemies up, right, by fading or feign deathing and losing the aggro of the mobs that you've pulled, or some of them, right? So Bards have an ability where they spend mana and they go invisible and they completely delete themselves from the enemy's list of hatred, right? Monks kind of do the same thing. It just takes a little bit longer. They have an ability that doesn't use mana called Feign Death. So they'll go run in, they'll smack somebody in the mouth, they'll run back out to where the group is, and they'll pretend to die. And the mobs will stop and be like, oh, he's dead. Well, I guess our work is done here. And like 3 or 4 of them will walk back, and 2 of them will be sitting up front. And then the rest of your party will go, now is the time to strike. And then you attack those guys, and then you slowly progress forward. A little bit less useful in the era of where you only have 3 or 4 people at the maximum. Maybe you have only yourself or 2 people. However, it is useful for when, say, you are playing with someone else and they are the tank and they're tanking all that damage, and then all of a sudden you're doing too much damage, and the big bad boss that's smacking your tank turns to you and goes, oh, okay, now I'm going to get some revenge. I'm going to bust you. And then you go, pretend to be dead. And then the boss goes, "Oh, he's dead. Well, I'll go back to attacking the tank then." And then you stand up 3 seconds later and go, "Surprise, mother!" And then you just start punching him again. So that's kind of like what Monk's marquee thing is. Um, but mostly monks, and you'll find it with the next class we talk about with rogues, and the class we talk about after that with berserkers. They leverage that stamina meter that I talked to about in the beginning. And when they get to that higher level area, the 50 plus level, they get some really interesting disciplines that they're going to activate. They're going to use the stamina to throw really nasty flying kicks like that right there. They're going to use the ability to counter every single attack that comes at them. They're going to use the ability to not miss any attack in combat for like the next 20 seconds. They're going to leverage those disciplines. They have unique gear that only they can wear. They get bonuses to their armor class for carrying less junk around. They get a lot higher agility and dexterity. So they take less damage, they deal more damage, they proc a little bit more than the average, class will. Just a really interesting and unique DPS class that is fun to play and has a lot of utility, more so than you would think, right? Monks struggled a little bit early, but they've been constantly and consistently and appropriately buffed by the developers, and now they're very strong. They're almost as strong as rogues, in my opinion. The only thing that sets rogues apart, I think, is that they have a very specific weapon type that can be really leveraged to do a lot of extra damage. Um, but one thing I want to talk about with monks, rogues, and berserkers specifically is that when we talked a lot about slows when we talked about some of the caster classes, right? So the way slows work is it reduces your attack speed, right? So like if you get slowed by the enemy and you're 50% slowed, every time you go to auto swing your weapons, you're going to swing them 50% slower, and so on. Now, with monk, rogue, and berserker, you actually get extra attack buttons. Monks get flying kick, dragon punch, tiger claw, eagle strike, those kind of things. Some of them lock each other out, but some of them don't. Rogues get a backstab, berserkers get a frenzy. These are purely physical extra attack buttons. They are not, I repeat, they are not affected by slows in general. Some abilities in the game will reduce the ability of you to any abilities you have to cool down at all, but most slows are just talking about your regular attack speed. So if I walk into the fight as a monk and I get slowed by like 80%, I'm going to do a lot less damage. Of course I would. But I'm still going to be flying kicking and dragon punching at the exact same rate as those two extra attacks come off of cooldown. And this actually helps you, especially if you don't have a way to remove those slows, to continue to do a lot of damage to bosses and beat them anyway through their stupid slow garbage, right? And berserkers, same thing with frenzy, rogue, same thing with backstab. We'll talk about them in a few seconds. But it's something to note that the pure DPS classes that give up casting spells and gain a lot of disciplines, what they don't get in survivability like a warrior would, or they don't get in maybe like extra procking like a warrior would, they make up for in unique abilities that attack and get around some of the game's like very important mechanics. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're picking your classes and like trying to fit a DPS in there. If you want to be in melee, I'd strongly suggest taking one of the melee DPS classes to complement that, whether it's bard, monk, rogue, or berserker. All right, let's move on to the rogue. The rogue is your typical thief, like sneaky, stealthy type character. Anybody in theory in the game can use poisons, but they can only use a very weak version of poisons. Rogue can use the strongest version of poisons. They sneak around, they stab people in the back, side, whatever, do extra damage, backstab them twice, backstab them 3 times, all sorts of interesting stuff like that. Basically everything that mirrors the monk, but instead of flying kicks and, super 1-inch punch strikes of doom, you have a stabby weapon, and you stabby harder than anybody else stabbies. That's just how it goes. The big advantage of rogues right now on our server, THJ, is that if you use a one-handed piercing weapon in your main hand, and that weapon is only usable by the rogue class, instead of your backstab modifier being ×2 damage, your backstab modifier becomes ×3 damage. So there you go. Just 100% more damage on your 200% damage becomes 300% damage like that. Now, typically a rogue piercing weapon, it's going to be a little bit lower damage than average. And, it might have a good effect or it might not. But again, remember, your backstab button is not something that's easily to be slowed. In fact, I don't think anything in the game comes along that slows actual ability cooldowns until quite a bit later than what we're working with right now. So when I was fighting the endgame boss last night, Quarm, who's a nasty guy, he's got all sorts of crazy stuff. He spawns ads that slow you down to 80%. I'm sitting there with my friend and I'm doing way less damage because I'm 80% slowed. I've got all the ads that are slowing me on me so that he can stay alive and proc all of his heals and keep whooping. And I'm sitting there and I'm going like, man, I'm not doing anywhere near as. Oh yeah, but even though I'm not attacking for 200 or 300 every round, I'm backstabbing for 5,000. And sometimes when I backstab 3 times for 6,000, 7,000 damage. And I don't even have a new weapon from the new content that we're in. So rogues can really get down and dirty with some damage. And every time I backstab, I can also proc those poisons I was talking about, which can also crit, like they were spells. So there's all sorts of nutty stuff that rogues get done. They can add an extra thing. You'd think they'd stack all attack damage. No, they can also stack spell power, and they can hit you with poisons. They can change elements. So like, oh, hey, this boss is immune to poison. That's cool. I'll apply a fire poison to my weapon and use fire damage. I'll apply an ice poison to my weapon and use ice damage. They have all those options. They can apply slows to their weapons if they find the right poison they can make, and they can slow an enemy just like your shaman or your enchanter could, or your beast lord, all sorts of cool options like that. And then you add in a bunch of extra utility. Rogues have the best ability in the game for sneaking past stuff you don't want to deal with. They get hide and they get sneak. Now, some other classes get these hide and sneak abilities, but they are very, very low skill cap. Rogues take those skill caps all the way to the top. And when a rogue hides and then sneaks, almost no enemies in the entire game, even the ones that can see invisible, will see a rogue when they're hide sneaked. So you can literally walk past all the junk in a zone to the end boss and smash them, take your loot, and get out of there. Now, some zones, you got to kill 8 bosses to spawn the boss. Unfortunate. However, you can still sneak past all the junk mobs in front of each boss. Most of the time. Sometimes you can't. There are some zones, especially in Plains of Power, there's 2 or 3 zones, where certain mobs will still see you if you're hide sneaked. But if you know who they are, you just avoid them, and you go and do whatever else you want. It's great for skipping content. The Monk's Feigned Death that we just talked about, Shadow Knights and Necromancers also have this Feigned Death. They just have it as a spell. This can be used to skip fast stuff as well. You just run through 100 guys and you feign death at the end. And then after a few minutes, they realize, oh, he's dead. We're out of here. And they walk away. The Bard's Fade removes them from the aggro table. It's much, much better. But the Rogue's Hide Sneak doesn't even get you on the aggro table at all. You just walk right past everybody. See you later. I'm out of here. So all sorts of other cool, unique abilities rogues get. They can assassinate humanoid enemies. Oh yeah, let's go back and talk about like rangers real quick. Rangers have the ability to assassinate humanoid enemies with bow shots, similar to the way the paladins slay undead for free. Rogues, when they backstab a humanoid enemy, if it's a certain level or lower, they have a chance to instantly do like 100k damage and kill it. There's all sorts of interesting, cool utility rogues have, and they can evade AoE damage and so on. And all these melee classes we're talking about right now have an alternate advancement ability that allows them, if they kill an enemy that would normally give them experience in melee combat, they have a percentage chance on that kill to get a heal and a damage buff, which allows them to do a lot more AoE damaging, or like pulling like 8 or 9 mobs in at once and killing them all and getting that survivability, even if they don't have a healing class to heal themselves in between. So, I think Rogue, Beast Lord, Rogue, Berserker, Monk have it for sure, and I think there maybe was one more. But yeah, it's called Killing Spree. It's one of those things, and you get a rank for free when you make a character that has one of these classes, or you add that class on. Really cool and interesting mechanic. Rogues, absolutely love them. Tons of fun. One of the better damage dealers out there. And let's talk about Berserker last. Berserker, pretty obvious. We've got the stabby, sneaky man We've got the hi-ya flying kicks to your throat guy. And we've got the sing-song, use a bunch, 2 weapons and proc all a bunch. What are we missing? We're missing Conan with the big giant battle axe that walks in and just goes thunk. And that's what the Berserker does. The Berserker walks up to you and goes, hey, check out this giant 2-handed smashing stick I've got. Thwack. Hey, check out this giant sword. Slice. Hey, check out this giant axe. Cleave. And they just cleave your skull in two. That's what they do. They have an ability called Frenzy. It works like Backstab and like the other things we're talking about, the flying kicks and stuff. It exists kind of outside of melee combat. You push the button, bam. And it can get upgraded. It does way more damage. It can generate extra attacks. All sorts of crazy stuff. It can double attack, triple attack, all sorts of things. And that's pretty much what Berserkers do. They're very similar to Rogues and Monks, just doing the same amount of damage a different way. They have a different type of utility. They don't have any way to evade enemies, but they have a bunch of extra range attacks that are just kind of built into their character, where they throw axes, or they have a ability that throws axes without you even having to have any throwing axes on you. They have a discipline that does it, right? So Berserkers have a lot more disciplines than the other classes as well. They kind of leverage those a little bit more. They get like a war cry, which is similar to Bards, where it's a discipline, but it buffs you and your party, gives you a bunch of attack, strength, haste, all that kind of stuff. A little bit shorter cooldown and so on. Yeah, the Berserker's just trying to do mega damage. Now, that being said, when you combine Berserker with other classes, you don't necessarily even have to use a two-hander. You can combine Berserker, Rogue, and then some other class, like Paladin or Warrior. You can use a shield and like a one-hand piercer. You can backstab with the one-hand piercer. You can flurry with frenzy with the Warrior and attack a bunch of extra times. And you can absorb a bunch of damage with your shield as well, making you like a weird, like amazingly good tank, but also doing a ton of damage from the front. Rogues can backstab from the front, by the way. They don't have to be behind the enemy. It's an AA you get for free when you make a rogue. So like, there's all sorts of interesting combinations you can make with the Berserker that don't even have to use a two-handed weapon. But Paladins and Shadow Knights get the ability to shield bash while they're using a two-handed weapon. So you'll often see Berserkers combine with those two classes to be able to leverage their two-handed epic weapons, or other really good two-handed weapons, but also get some extra stun. Stuns do a lot of extra threat generation, so you want to stun a lot if you want to tank. So you typically will not see Berserkers combine with any other casters at all, but you'll see them combine with other damage dealers, other tanks, and occasionally a healer like a cleric or something, or like a beast lord that can really buff their damage up. And they're a lot of fun. They were the last class that was added into the game. Several expansions actually further than where we're playing right now, but it's interesting to see how they interact with the previous content. It isn't really necessarily designed for them. They really do a good job of interacting with it, which is kind of like interesting and just shows how like thought out the game was and how evergreen a lot of the stuff is. But yeah, they're a lot of fun. 100% recommend. I always have a blast playing them. They're awesome. Okay, and then we've only got I think 4 classes left. So we've got the different casters of of the game. And I believe I can be all. No, let me go here. Yeah, I can be all. Okay, so these are called. So when I talked about the healers before, they cast off of the wisdom stat. They cast off of like, oh, I'm wise, I'm pious, and all that, blah, 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 blah. So the other 4 casters in the game are intelligence casters. They cast off of their academic ability and so on and so forth. And there's 4 different types of those. So we'll just go in order down. Well, actually, you know what? We'll start with Wizard because Wizard's the easiest to explain. Wizard is the big bad damage daddy, okay? Or the big bad damage mommy, whatever you want to do. They cast the big blocks of ice out of the sky, the big fiery meteors out of the sky, and the big AoE damage of doom around them or targeted in the area that they're casting it at. That's what wizards do. They have some teleport skills and other things, but they are looking to damage you with all of their spells that they cast, and they're looking to crit those spells, and they're looking to bring absolute destruction to you in elemental form. Okay? Now, one thing that they can do a little bit differently than a lot of other classes is they get a lot of extra spell crit advancement abilities. Now, those spell crit advancement abilities can absolutely apply to the spells that can proc on your weapon swings. When you have like a melee class like Berserker or Shadow Knight or whatever, and you're attacking, the wizard's extra crit alternate advancement abilities can then apply to not only the spells you cast, but those spells that you proc from your weapons. So you'll see a lot of that happening with wizards often. And that's pretty much all they do, but they do it so well, and it's effective. It's a lot of fun to just watch somebody's health bar go chunk, chunk, dead. And you just hit them with 3 ice comments or whatever. If you can stand farther back and smash, you can absolutely do piles and piles of damage. Like I mentioned before with Druid, when you add Enchanter and you set up your spells correctly, and you summon your Enchanter clone illusion guys, they'll start casting those big nukes along with you. You can do a ton of range damage. It's like Ranger and Wizard are just like competing all the time for like who can drop the most damage from like the other side of the room. These two, like they just drop that damage. Wizard, a little bit less in terms of like thought process involved and how to play them, but still mega fun. Just dropping ice combats on people never gets old. So highly recommend checking them out, integrating them into your build, especially if you want to attack a lot with weapons that proc magic stuff. You'll do a lot of damage. You'll see them combined often with Shadow Knights, like I mentioned, and then Bards for the extra procs, Rogues for being able to backstab and sneak past stuff to farm things quickly. You'll even see them paired up with like Rangers as well for the ultimate damage AOE. Because again, Rangers can proc a lot more with those bow shots. So Wizards adding their extra crit spell damage on top of that often does a lot of work. And you'll see them all over the place. Wizards are great. Next, we'll go with the Magician. Magicians are sort of half wizards. They have a lot of AoE damage. They have some nukes, but they're like the summoners of the game. Okay, they summon pets. They do a lot of the fighting for them. They summon all sorts of interesting magical items, and their pets are the most upgradable of any pet in the game. There's lots of pet classes. Like I mentioned, the Beastlord can summon a pet. I mentioned the Shaman can summon a pet. The Ranger can summon a pet. But the Mage pet is the real pet, enforcer. Like that pet is the one that does the most damage. He tanks the easiest, and he's got the most slots that you can add gear to. So in THJ and some of the other emulators, and even the live server, mages get the ability to summon a special bag, and that bag holds a bunch of gear for your pet that your pet can wear and use. So you can give your pet your best melee weapons, and your pet will go into combat and use those really good melee weapons and beat people down with them. You can give him really good armor. He'll take a lot less damage. You can give your pet spell power and attack. He'll hit harder. He'll proc harder. Your pet casts some spells on his own, depending on what element he is. The earth one will root people. The fire one will nuke for fire damage. The air one will stun people. When you get the epic pet, he'll drop thunderbolts on people. All sorts of cool stuff like that. And just a lot of utility. They can summon bags, they can summon daggers, they can summon staffs that you can tap yourself for mana with. All sorts of cool and interesting stuff mages can do. I love the mage. It's one of my favorite ways to do damage as an intelligence caster. I play it. And one of the really cool things you can do with the mage towards the end game is once you buy elemental form AAs, is you can turn yourself into an elemental as well, and you take on the properties of that elemental. So if you need some mana regen because you're a mage, wizard, enchanter, and you're just dropping nukes on people all day, you could turn into a water elemental and get a bunch of extra mana regen. If you're a mage warrior like Beastlord or something, and you're just smashing people with your pets, but you're also in melee combat all day long, you can turn into an air elemental and stun people with every swing. Whatever. If you're like a paladin, mage, something, and you just want to be even more unkillable, you can turn into an earth elemental and absorb a bunch of extra damage just because you're a mage. Even though you're normally wearing robes, guess what? Paired up with a paladin, I'm wearing plate mail, and I'm also taking way less damage. Bam, bam, bam. And if you're me, bard, mage, rogue, I've got a, fire poison from rogue applied to my weapon. I've got a bunch of fire procs in my weapons. From an item that it gives me an extra fire proc, I turn into a fire elemental. The fire elemental ups the damage of all the fire sources I do. You can even do this as a wizard as well and just drop fire nukes. Turn into a fire elemental, run into combat, sit in the back, drop wizard fire nukes, drop fire mage nukes, and just do a bunch of extra fire damage. So there's all sorts of cool stuff with mages. They got all sorts of weird, cool utility abilities. They can summon people to them from across the zone. Doesn't work in all zones. They have some really good lowering resistance abilities that they share with shamans. They do some really nice enabling of the rest of their group to really get the most out of their spells. or do it for themselves. Love mages. A++, of course. Definitely check them out. They're awesome. Play them a ton. Oh, and let's go next to the Necromancer. So we kind of mentioned them a little bit briefly when we talked about the Shadow Knight, but the Necromancer is exactly what you think it is. They are the summoner of the undead. They summon a skeleton or like a specter pet to help them out. They do the big life taps. They have really nasty damage over time spells. They have all sorts of cool utility where they like sacrifice their life to get mana back. They have different interesting like cleric adjacent type of stuff where they can become immune. Um, all sorts of interesting things you can do with a necromancer. They pair up well with a lot of different classes. They can feign death as well, and all sorts of cool stuff like that. Um, some of the more unique stuff that they do is I think a little underpowered right now, and I think they will be buffed in the future. The only reason that they don't see as many things getting brought up to speed is because they are part of one of the most popular builds. Um, Using the pets that I mentioned from Mage and from Beast Lord, often they're combined with Necromancer to create a 3-pet combo of death. Or you'll see like a Mage and a Beast Lord combined with a Bard to where you have 2 pets of death, but then you also have like all the Bard songs that buff up the pets like crazy. And then you sit there and you just throw them in, you heal your pets, you do a lot of work. But in the recent launch of Planes of Power, damage over time spells have gotten quite a bit better. They are quicker to cast, they last longer, and Necromancer is probably the best at dealing damage over time that's in the game. And they're one of the tankiest casters because again, they can life tap the opponent, so they can do damage to the enemies while putting life back in their back pocket, and then they can sack that life for more mana, and they continue to do those things over and over again. The only really disadvantage Necromancer is going to have is they can't really lower the resistance of an enemy on their own. You'll want to combine them with a class that can do that, like Bard, Mage, Enchanter, and so on. And then, or you just want to add them as utility to like, an already existing caster combination. Like if you've got Enchanter, you definitely can set up some really nasty combinations with your Enchanter clones, like I mentioned a couple times. And if you've got like Shaman, you can really do, or Druid, you can stack some really nasty dots on enemies. And then as long as you have something that can run around in circles while the enemy just burns away, you can really do some nasty stuff. Necros just have a little bit less synergy with some of the melee, than other caster classes. Like I wouldn't combine Necro with like Paladin or Warrior as often as I would combine Shadow Knight with a lot of those other classes that are available, right? So Necro's still really good. I think as soon as they figure out the pet stuff and they like kind of like meta balance the pet stuff, which they're pretty close. I think it's getting really close that the pet classes are not like stars above everybody else anymore. They're very close. I think Necros will probably end up getting a buff on the back end because it'll make them more viable and synergistic with other classes other than like the ones that they're already really, really, really synergistic with, similar to the way we talked about Druids a little bit earlier. And then last but not least, of course, Enchanter. I played Enchanter quite a bit back in the day, in the Velios era, and I had a lot of fun playing them. The only issue with them is again they're kind of like at this like B plus tier. Really, what the Enchanter does, unfortunately, is a bit of jack of all trades type stuff like we were talking about before with the Druid. They're kind of like part Shaman, kind of like part like Necro, kind of like part Wizard a little bit. Like they have like the best mana regen buff in the game, but there's all sorts of ways to get mana regen with your alternate advancement abilities. Their marquee abilities are like charming enemies, which like doesn't work after a certain level. It definitely doesn't work in endgame content because enemies you charm have to be a little bit lower level than you, and most of the time you're fighting stuff. You're fighting stuff that's like 3 to 5 levels higher than you are. So that just doesn't really translate into the end game all that well. They've got really good slows, but not as good as slows as the Shaman does. They've got really decent, utility, but not as good of utility as a lot of the other classes we've talked about. They've got that unique doppelganger ability that creates clones of you that casts more spells. And that's really where they shine. So your Enchanter is kind of usually almost always going to be your third pick. It's going to be, hey, am I playing a nuke caster or a dot caster that really wants to double up or triple up on all the spells that they cast? That's when Enchanter is going to come into play for you, and they're going to do some decent work for you. Unfortunately, though, right now, I think they still do need a lot of buffs. and I think they're going to get them because Enchanter's a really cool concept. It's not the type of class that a lot of other games have. Like the only other class I can think of that even comes close is one of the ones in Guild Wars 2, where it's like like you're really like a mage. It's all about control, and just unfortunately a lot of the control stuff just doesn't work right now. Or like mobs are too high level to be controlled. So in the interest of game balance, the developers don't want you being able to go around and like if there's a really tough boss and he summons like four additional enemies or whatever, they don't want an enchanter or a bard or whoever to just go mesmerize that guy, mesmerize that guy, mesmerize that guy, mesmerize that guy, and now we just kill the boss and we ignore these guys that are supposed to be a part of the mechanics of this fight. Like we have to manage them, right? So they often make these enemies a little bit too high level to be mesmerized or controlled, and then a lot of the enchanter's utility just kind of falls off from there. And that's why they just don't really deliver the way they do. They were super, absolutely, totally broken when the game first deployed because the way that the doppelganger clones worked was they were more melee helpers than spellcaster helpers, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense when you think about it. But if I'm running around as a paladin, berserker, enchanter, and I summon 5 copies of myself that all have a holy avenger sword and all frenzy attack with it over and over again, I mean, I'm kind of just like a group of 6 dudes that all have ridiculous damage and survivability, right? So they kind of retooled that ability to really be more in line with what an enchanter does, which is supposed to be a spellcaster, and they created a bunch of additional synergies with spellcasters and nukers. So that's really where enchanter's sweet spot is right now. There was a point in the game where I might have said they might have been the worst class, but I think they're definitely now above that. And again, when I say worst, I don't mean bad. They just don't have the amount of synergy and interplay that a lot of other classes have. They will. It's just going to take a little bit more time for the devs to think about what they can do and adjust some of the numbers while also not creating something completely totally busted. Because when enchanters were creating doppelgangers that absolutely slapped, they were being integrated into those pet builds that I was talking about with mages and beast lords and necromancers, and really, really amping up all the minion damage. So there you go. That's all 16 classes available to you in the Hero's Journey or normal EverQuest if you want to go check that out as well. But just with a nice little view on how you can combine them together, what they do, some of the synergies, some of the basic ideas where things overlap and don't overlap. One key thing to remember, though, is when you're creating and theory crafting your class combinations, you don't get abilities that will stack over on each other. So, when I mentioned at the top about warriors and paladins having that nasty, awesome one-handed weapon and shield ability, if you pick both warrior and paladin, you get that ability, but you don't get double the amount of ranks of that ability. You just get the exact amount that one would normally have, and then that's the cap, right? So sometimes it doesn't really pay to pick the same thing 3 times, right? So you're really encouraged to kind of take a little bit of this, take a little bit of that, find the synergy, put it together, not just stack up 3 warriors or 3 monks on top of each other. That's been nerfed. You can't do that. But no, it's way more cool this way. It opens up gear options and everything. You can have casters that are running around wearing plate because you have a bard. Bards wear plate in this game. You can have a monk running around that's wearing a bunch of cleric gear because he's also a cleric. So he's got plate on as well. And you can have all sorts of cool combinations like that. You can also have a bard mage rogue like myself running around with a mage robe on the chest because I want all the extra spell damage that gives me that gets channeled through my weapon procs, even though I'm not getting as much armor class because it's a robe and not a chest plate, steel or whatever. So you can kind of decide and make and choose those different, things to integrate into your build the way you want. So thanks for hanging out with me, guys. Thanks for chilling and going through all the classes. I actually got this done a little bit quicker than I thought. 90 minutes isn't bad for how much information there is to kind of throw at you. So yeah, check me out. My links are going to be down in the description box below. I try to play THJ a bunch. I try to stream it live every Tuesday night. We're going to see how that goes. I'm going to try to do it as much as I can in the future. I stream the recording of these live, so come check me out over there and come join the Discord. jump on the app, get it downloaded, post on the Discord. Let us know if you need some help. There's a bunch of people in the community that are always willing to help out and run you through stuff, explain things, teach you the ropes, whatever you need. And there's a giant Wikipedia page. There's guides. There's tons of people out there willing to help. Have fun. Just because all the content's designed to be able to be soloable or doable with one of your friends doesn't mean you can't take 6 people into a zone and have a good old time blowing up all the old school bosses. And we look forward to seeing you out there in the plains of power. I'll see you next time. Tony Ortiz, take care of yourself, take care of each other. Take it easy.